think you've got to remember that they were semi-independent states, or they were independent till they accepted British authority. So they were never really aligned with, Ranjit Singh. In fact, they sort of feared him. But looking at it from their point of view, they would have lost their independence. So, from their point of view, it was worth allying themselves with the British. And that's what they did.
Hey, it's Ramnuggar Sadulpore here with another episode of the Sorch podcast. Today our special guest is Amarpal Sidhu, who will be helping us to uncover the truth about the Anglo-Sikh Wars. If you're new here and would like to support the work we're doing, please make sure to like, comment and subscribe, as it means more than you could imagine. Also, don't forget to watch this until the end as we uncover the truth about the Anglo-Sikh Wars, find out about the traitors within the ranks of the Sikh army, and also there's a few bloopers near the end. So, let's get into it. So, today I have the pleasure to talk to Amarpal Sidhu, a software industry expert as well as a military historian. Amarpal has published 2 books focused on the Anglo-Sikh Wars, the first being published in 2013 and the second in 2016, as well as a recent book published in July this year focusing on and titled The Siege of Delhi. Amarpal has also appeared and collaborated on history programs for several TV channels. So yeah, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thanks for having me on your show, Amar.
One thing that we like to do kind of before we get into the main topic of discussion is just to find a little bit more out about yourself, kind of family background, how you ended up kind of where, just like many of us in diaspora, like where we are today. And then also kind of why did you decide to go into history, and especially, I know that's a lot, and especially the Anglo-Sikh Wars. I know that's a hell of a lot to kind of ask you in one go. But feel free to start wherever you feel.
I got into history pretty early, actually. My parents came to this country during my father came here in 68, and so I came here 69 when I was about 6 years old. And so we've been here quite a while. We used to live in Gravesend, actually, which is one of the sort of main centres of, sort of community, if you like. And so I've spent most of my life here in the UK. Then we sort of moved several places to Coventry and Nottingham, but I did my studying here in London, and I did a degree in electronics, actually, but a master's in software engineering. So I was in the sort of technology side of things for a long time. And but my real sort of interest was in history. So I've always been into history, ever since I was a kid. Used to read about anything and everything, really. So I was a bit of a general sort of history fan, but never much anything to do with Sikh history, really, at that stage. And but that sort of interest developed probably about maybe 15, 20 years ago, and I started sort of gradually sort of looking more into Sikh history and Punjabi history in general, and in fact a certain amount of Indian history as well. And I always had this sort of idea of writing myself, but being a sort of a software engineer, you never really find the time to do your own thing. It's with a full-time job. And I got at some stage I decided I'm going to try and give that up and just try and do a bit of writing full-time. And that's what happened, actually. Maybe it was just a midlife crisis or whatever. But I decided to just try and move into more writing by myself. And I found that there wasn't a lot of books on, specifically Sikh history and specifically, Anglo-Sikh Wars, and that I started getting quite interested in that. Now, there are a lot of books, but a lot of them tend to be sort of 19th century, first-hand accounts, and you got books like Goff and Innes, which again is 19th century, which are good. They're first-hand accounts, but these wars were sort of I don't know about forgotten, but there wasn't so many modern sort of history books that were coming out on these wars over the last 40, 50 years. And in fact, I suppose a lot of the sort of British Raj period wars, there's not so much on these days. I think schools have sort of moved away from sort of British Empire history and what have you. And I remember when I was at school, things like Henry VIII and whatever, that sort of thing. They've moved away from that, and they're doing sort of Russian Revolution and American War of Independence and that sort of stuff. But they moved away from that. So this is sort of been more sort of pushed into the shade. These sort of British Raj period histories. So I decided to just bring out something by myself. And so that resulted in first Anglo-Sikh War, and then a few years later the second Anglo-Sikh War, and in fact I've just brought out a book on the siege of Delhi as well. So I'm quite heavily into the mutiny at the moment as well, 1857 uprisings. So there's a book coming out, or I'm working on a book on the mutiny in the Punjab and what was happening in the Punjab in 1857, which hasn't really been, again, it's not really been covered very well by older history books or even modern history books. They tend to concentrate on Delhi or Lucknow, and that sort of stuff. So Punjab's been sort of, there's a whole sort of fresh story there that needs to be told. So that's what I'm working on at the moment. So yeah, it's all sort of almost, it's not, I wouldn't call it new ground, but it's ground that hasn't really been, well covered in the past.
Well, definitely. Just picking your brain on a couple of things. So, actually, one thing that you mentioned about the what you were taught at school for history. I was doing my GCSE probably like 15 years ago now, and it was the same. I was taught the same modules that you just described. I was taught the same stuff. It was World War II, Henry VIII, Italian fascism, Nazi Germany, Russian Revolution, Vietnam. Nothing, absolutely zero to do with any mention of the empire or kind of anything to do with any other history. So I think it's quite interesting that much hasn't really changed, although I think things are perhaps now starting to change. Then also when you were mentioning kind of the 19th century books that pertain to the Anglo-Sikh Wars, would it be fair to say that a lot of them are also written from a British perspective, in that it's kind of, it's not necessarily looking at the Anglo-Sikh Wars in its greater context? It's kind of just viewing it as perhaps another hurdle in the way of the empire at that point?
Well, I think it varies. I'm always fascinated by the first-hand accounts. So anyone who writes first-hand accounts, they tend to be very frank. And a lot of the first-hand accounts tend to be quite fair as well. I think it's that sort of respect that soldiers have for fellow soldiers, even if they're on the other side. They're both risking their lives. There is this mutual respect. So a lot of the first-hand accounts tend to be quite frank, and they criticize their own officers and generals as well. So that's almost the truest sort of account, if you like. And but historians, when they write about these things, they obviously have their own, I wouldn't call it agenda, but it's their way of looking at things, their perspective. So you tend to get, a certain point of view, if you like, added in. For instance, for the Anglo-Sikh Wars, that whether was it the Sikhs who initiated these wars, and that's what you'll get with a lot of European accounts. I suppose a lot of these books having been written during the the British Raj period, it's natural for them to sort of to show that point of view anyway. A lot of books tend to show the British almost sort of stumbling upon an empire, if you like, Bengal, and then, having to fight the Marathas and having to fight the Sikhs. And, it's almost like they just fell upon, they just stumbled upon an empire, which is far from the truth as well. So you get a sort of wide sort of variety of opinion and the way books are written, as you go through the ages, if you like.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I guess then just diving into our first question pertaining to the Anglo-Sikh Wars, and I think you kind of touched upon it slightly by mentioning how there's this debate about whether the Sikhs initiated it or whether it was like the British who had done that. Now, one thing that it kind of comes up, and again, this is actually from reading a couple of first-hand accounts that I managed to get hold of. One was by a Sergeant Pearman, I think. So it was Pearman's memoirs. And again, just as you were saying, like, they're very frank, they're very honest. They criticize their superior officers. I think the bit for me that stood out in that book was when Pearman states that after one of the battles, he scalped a Singh that he found on the battlefield to make the plume for his helmet. And I thought, for me, that just blew me out of the water, because that's the type of information I don't think you're going to find anywhere else. You're only going to find that in a first-hand account. So Pearman's memoirs, and another book, which I think is also called The Anglo-Sikh Wars by H. Cook. It's a 1975 book. They refer to the Anglo-Sikh Wars as simply just the Sikh Wars. That, like, as in, so this term Anglo-Sikh War seems to have been kind of a more recent term that's been created to describe this. Like, what do you know about the change in reference?
I think it was just a custom at that point, taken from the British perspective of labeling things according to the community that they were fighting, or the nation that were fighting. So you'll get the Anglo-Sikh Wars being called the Sikh Wars, or if they're fighting the Zulus, the Zulu Wars, or other places, the Maratha Wars, or whatever. But I think this sort of custom of putting Anglo in front is a more sort of modern sort of idea, and I think it's more a sort of a more neutral sort of term, if you like, and a more accurate term. So it tells you it was a British fighting the Sikhs. But on its own, it's from a more British perspective. Just the Sikh Wars doesn't really tell you who they were fighting against. So yeah, but I don't read too much into it. I think it's more it's something that it's sort of changed over time, hasn't it? I think if you look at books, they all the very old ones, the 19th century ones, will almost definitely call it just the Sikh Wars.
Okay. Well, the reason that I ask you this, and also the next question that's going to come up, is because when I've spoken to some of the previous podcast guests, they've kind of picked apart the term, and they're often referred to as the Sikh Wars or the Anglo-Sikh Wars. But it's also kind of pointing out that perhaps doesn't fit neatly into those two categories. So although the Sikh army obviously consisted mainly of Sikhs, 10 battalions out of 62 are Muslim, Hindu and Gurkha units as well. 50% of the artillery were Muslim on top of that. So obviously, like, I think just trying to point out that although we view it as an Anglo-Sikh Wars, the kind of the armies themselves are comprised of various different groups and people. Even the British Army, I was reading, so the Bengal Army, the largest of the three British presidencies in 1842, had a fifth Muslims, and the Hindus themselves were then categorized within other groups like Rajputs, Brahmins, and lower caste men. So would it then be fair to say, especially with kind of just a little bit that we've gone over, that the use of Anglo-Sikh is probably just referring to the political entities of the conflict rather than reflecting kind of the communities, for want of a better word?
That's right. Yeah, I mean, it's easier just to call it the Anglo-Sikh Wars. In fact, it was a Lahore state, founded by Ranjit Singh against the empire of the East India Company. If you really want to be sort of accurate about it, but it gets sort of simplified to the Anglo-Sikh Wars. And I think you made a good point there. The Sikhs were a minority, in the Punjab, and if you look at the Sikh army, you had a huge sort of diversity of people, employed in the army. Everyone. There was Gurkhas as well, and there was even a fair number of sepoys from the British force, British East India Company's forces, who had decided that they could get I think the pay of the East India Company sepoys at that time was about 6 rupees, but they could get 7 rupees, fighting for the Sikh army. So that 1 rupee out of 6 is quite an appreciable sort of jump. And so there's a fair number of sepoys that had actually left the East India Company's forces to join the Sikh army as well. So a lot of people don't realise that. And I mentioned Gurkhas, and there was Pathans, and there was all sorts of, and in fact, various British officers had not European officers had joined the forces as well. And you had a certain number of low-ranking Europeans as well fighting on the ground.
I was just about to ask you, actually. I was just about to ask about that, because obviously Ranjit Singh's empire is kind of famously known for having a lot of ex-Napoleonic generals, especially people from France and a few from Germany and other places across Europe. I think there was also an American general maybe in amongst the mix. But kind of Europeans as just normal foot soldiers, I've not actually heard or come across them much, or as much as perhaps kind of people higher up in the army. Like, what could you kind of say about that? Was there I can't assume there were a lot of them. And again, with these people who would kind of come over from the East India Company, or were they actually just kind of there in the pursuit of pay?
Well, there was a fair number of Europeans who were just looking for employment, and they didn't necessarily need to have been employed as officers or as generals in European armies. They were simply in India, adventurers, if you like, looking for employment. So there were, I won't say there was a lot, but there was a certain number of, Europeans who actually joined the Sikh army at the ground level, if you like. And in fact, there was a few, English chaps as well, fighting in at Sobraon, at Ferozeshah, Aliwal as well. And there's various sort of accounts of these guys who were killed by the British soldiers, because they were seen as traitors, if you like, for having joined the Sikh army. And but just going back to your previous point, the same, this sort of very multinational army that the Sikhs had was sort of mirrored, by the British as well. So you've got to remember that the British were a very small number, in India. I think that the actual peak of Europeans or British being in India were, I think, it's about 250,000 at the most, and that includes civilians and military personnel. So it wasn't a lot. So, their army was sort of consisted, roughly of about a third of Europeans and then 2/3 of sepoys. So they had a very sort of a sort of vast mixture of soldiers as well in their thing. So it was it was a war of two empires, but the people that were leading were actually minorities within their own sort of spheres, if you like. But that's always the case in India. If you look back in history, the Mughals were very few in number, but they were very organized, and they conquered the country, very few in number. And before that, the Afghans as well. You had a lot of Afghan dynasties, right up to Bengal, from Punjab to Bengal, and various other places, very small in number as well. So, that tells you something about India. If you're organized, you can, really, really make it big time. So yeah, definitely the case for both sides.
Yeah, no, thank you. Have you ever come across then accounts of any Sikh soldiers? Like, I know you've mentioned sepoys that were fighting for the British, but have you come across any Sikh soldiers who fought on the side of the British against Zinjit's empire?
I can't say I have. Yeah. I mean, obviously the Cis-Sutlej states, states like Patiala and Jind, Nabha, they were actually allied with the British. During the first Anglo-Sikh War, they pretty much stayed neutral. So they didn't help either the British, although they helped them, in terms of allowing supplies through their territory, but they didn't actually help the British, substantially in terms of the fighting. It was the same again in the Second Anglo-Sikh War. Again, you had these states helping the British, and of course you had the Lahore Darbar itself in the Second Anglo-Sikh War, actually actively assisting the British with their supplies, against their own army. So there was that, but in terms of them actually, being on the battlefield against the Sikh army, I don't think that was the case. There may have been a few.
No. Thank you. So just moving on then, there's a generalized view that the Sikh empire or the Sikh army had more soldiers, more guns, better supplies, and they lost in general over the wars, mainly due to internal treachery. So I put out a post when we first discussed doing this podcast to ask everyone to send in their questions about the Anglo-Sikh Wars, and the one that I'm sure you can imagine kept coming up was about just we were betrayed, and that's why we lost. Otherwise we would have won. And kind of the reasons that were coming up were internal treachery, inability to pay soldiers, and a lack of leadership to manage an army that just seemed to become increasingly independent, kind of from the first Anglo-Sikh War onwards. Now, given kind of all of that, what do you think is actually kind of like, what is the decisive reason for why the British were able to win? So I haven't spent much time doing any research or reading, but the little I did, it kind of seemed like on paper the British were scared and fearful of getting into a full-blown war with the Sikh Empire, and again, the main kind of reasons that kept coming up were blaming Lal Singh and Tej Singh, along kind of a number of other smaller issues, for the collapse of the Sikh Empire. So what, in your perspective, then, was the decisive thing either the British possessed or the Sikh army lacked that kind of tipped the balance in the way that kind of it panned out?
Well, I mean, this is a huge question, actually. We could probably, sort of discuss this for a couple of hours. This whole business of, what actually went wrong. But you touched on a number of issues there, and they're all correct. What happened after Ranjit Singh died was that, in all honesty, there was nobody there to fill his shoes. I think that's a sort of key issue. and that happens, with a lot of people. A lot of these great leaders, when they go, if you look at Alexander the Great, or sort of Genghis Khan or whatever, this great chap suddenly disappears, unless you're lucky. The empire tends to fall apart. As with Alexander the Great, you just got the whole thing just went to pieces, and that was unfortunately the case with the Sikh Empire as well. Nobody to fill his shoes. I don't think anybody was really sort of trained up to sort of as an heir, if you like, in terms of, he had his son Hari Singh, but he wasn't really. I think that was one of his weaknesses, Ranjit Singh's actually. He didn't realize that he would be passing on, and maybe in his last 5, 6 years, 10 years, he should have sort of taken a slight back seat and allowed his grandson Nonihal Singh to sort of establish himself in power, if you like. There just wasn't a precedent in the Punjab for this. This was a first Sikh empire, and he was the founder of the Sikh Empire. So you didn't have that sort of historical sort of foundation, for the state to pass from one hand to another, if you like. So there was a great danger there that when he passed away, that it would just simply disintegrate. It didn't disintegrate straight away. It took another 6, 7 years. People tend to, as you mentioned, the army became increasingly stronger. And in one sense, you can't blame them, because, there was such weak sort of central control, if you like. The whole Lahore Darbar had lost its inspirational figure, if you like. They were good at what they did if they had a good leader. Without that good leader, whatever their talents were, it became much more fractious, much more, it basically just fell to pieces, really. So in one sense, you can't blame the army, but then you can, because they ultimately led to its fall. A lot of people blame the Dogras and Lal Singh, Tej Singh, and again, that is true, that these people weren't particularly interested in handling the state. But these were, I see them more as sort of mercenaries, if you like, outsiders who came into the state. And when a state's falling, it's, a mercenary will just look to, his own future, if you like, what's best for me. They can actually see the state falling, and it's everyone for himself at that stage, and that's what they were doing. They realized that the state was disintegrating, and let me take as much as I can out of this. And it wasn't just them, it was the other members of the Lahore Darbar as well, who were actually approaching the British at this stage. Not a lot of people know this, but Sher Singh, who was who took over after Nonihal Singh, he actually approached the British as well. He was frightened of the Sikh army. He was frightened of being assassinated. He wanted their blessing, if you like, and their assistance, if you like, to stay in power. So very, very quickly after Ranjit Singh, this idea of going to the British for help, or offering them certain portions of the Punjab for their backing, came into sort of vogue, if you like. And lastly, I suppose it was the leadership. When the Anglo-Sikh Wars broke out, you unfortunately had these people like Lal Singh and Tej Singh in power, and somebody should have decided that these their minds are not in it. These are the wrong people to lead the army. But, there was this, this sort of residue of discipline, if you like. And, it's very difficult to unseat somebody, if you like. You either assassinate them in that particular, scenario, those years after Ranjit Singh, you either assassinate them or you just leave them in place. There's people don't usually resign and, just disappear. So that was the case. So, you had these chaps who had no intention of winning, really. And the Sikh army knew, the ordinary Sikh soldier knew that their hearts weren't in it. But the problem was that even the officers in the Sikh army were not given the respect and the obedience that they should have. So, the whole sort of officer level right up to general were, not really with the common soldier, if you like. So, it was a whole, comprehensive, anything that could go wrong went wrong, and this is a sort of classic case of a decline and fall of an empire, with everything, just crumbling away in one go.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think for me, I was having a debate with a friend the other day, which was again, it was about the Anglo-Sikh Wars, and I was saying if either, and it'd be interesting to see what your opinion is of this, which is I thought if either Akali Phula Singh or Hari Singh Nalwa or someone of that stature was still alive around this period, I think things would have very much gone a different way. Because I think what's interesting is everyone very much centers the debate around Maharaj and Jeet Singh Ji not being present and therefore the state collapsing, which is obviously valid. But I also think it's interesting to look at some of the other individuals who were quite central in some of his expansion. So obviously Akali Phula Singh dies, becomes Shaheed in I can't remember where they're trying to conquer. I think it's Kashmir or somewhere. And the account of how sad Maharaj Ranjit Singh Ji is quite interesting. Hari Singh Nalwa obviously being a warrior that even the British are kind of almost commending in their newspapers. But on the flip side, one thing that I found really interesting was a lot of the British accounts and the British reports in India make point of the fact that their soldiers are absolutely decimated by diseases and cholera and all sorts. So one thing that I find interesting, and perhaps you'd kind of be able to share some information like what it's like for Punjabi, so to speak, because it's almost like one of the stats that I read was that when one regiment lost 90 men to cholera in 1 month. Another, when leaving Ludhiana, had 135 out of 700 men in hospital. So we're talking quite significant numbers of British soldiers or soldiers fighting on the British side just being incapacitated from disease and the weather. What is it like then for the Punjabis? Are they impacted as much as the British? And then kind of further on from that, how are the British still able to win with all, it's almost like they've got everything on paper. It's almost as though everything possible to make the British seem weak and almost unable to conquer the Punjab is present. But actually when kind of the battles take place and everything happens, it seems far easier than it should have been. How much does kind of disease and the weather impact than the Sikh side of things? Or I guess they're just far more acclimatized.
Yeah, there's not that many records actually on how the Sikh army fared in this respect. But certainly, when cholera breaks out, then all bets are off. But in terms of the odds being against the Sikhs or against the British, I think you've got to remember that during the first Anglo-Sikh War, the Sikh army was effectively divided into almost four pieces, if you like. So you had an army under Lal Singh, an army under Tej Singh, and then you also had an army at opposite Ludhiana as well, with I've forgotten his name now, and there was also a lot of troops that stayed in the Punjab to protect the Peshawar from any sort of invasion by the Afghans. And so you had sort of almost the Sikh armies essentially being split up into 4 separate pieces, and the idea for Lal Singh and Tej Singh was to sort of almost feed these pieces one by one to the British. And in fact, Lal Singh's army was actually broken up into a separate 2 pieces as well, if you like. So, when the first battle between the British and the Sikhs broke out at Mudki, you had a Sikh force there. You had a Sikh force at Ferozeshah, just 5-6 miles away. You had another Sikh force, Sikh army under Tej Singh at Ferozepur, and then you had one at Phillaur, opposite Ludhiana. And there's all sorts of numbers of troops in Punjab as well. So it wasn't the whole of the Sikh army fighting against whatever the British could sort of muster up and bring. It was a much more sort of weakened force. And like I said, that was a plan of Lal Singh and Tej Singh, was to sort of divide up the Sikh army and sort of feed it piecemeal, if you like, to the British, and that's what happened. But despite that, you have to factor in that the British commander-in-chief Gough was actually almost overconfident, if you like. He thought it'd be very easygoing, and they found at Mudki that it wasn't going to be easygoing. And at Ferozeshah, he simply wasn't prepared for the kind of battle that actually occurred. And anyone who's read anything on Ferozeshah will probably know that things were actually as bad as they could be for the British at that point. They'd run out of ammunition. They hadn't brought any sort of food with them. They hadn't brought any of their baggage with them, any supplies with them. It's a depth of winter. They didn't have any baggage, anything to keep themselves warm, any coats, no water as well. So it was a very winnable situation for the Sikhs, if they'd had the right commander at that point ready to, take the initiative. So yeah, you're right. You mentioned Hari Singh Nalwa and people of that ilk had unfortunately died by that time, and Sham Singh Atariwala, he'd retired, he was quite old. So you had the kind of generals that Ranjit Singh had at his disposal just weren't there at that time anyway. So it's a complicated situation. People tend to simplify it, and but if we'd had Sham Singh Atariwala actually leading the force at that stage at Ferozeshah, then things would have been very different.
No, thank you for that. I did think so, but it's always interesting to get kind of another opinion or a different perspective on things. So no, thank you for that. You've kind of answered this question, but I'm just gonna kind of just go over it to see if what I thought you would say is actually the truth. So I think from what I've gathered so far is that actually with the Anglo-Sikh Wars, there are a number of kind of smaller issues that all kind of help create the circumstance, which obviously then leads to its demise. And much of this is down to the fact that, when I say much of it, kind of a portion of the blame is kind of put towards the fact that we have commanders like Lal Singh, Tej Singh, etc., which almost, due to the way they manage everything, kind of incapacitates the Sikh army to a certain degree. Obviously, like you said, splitting it up into all of these kind of smaller pieces. So by doing that, does that also, so for argument's sake, like I've read in a number of reports that the Sikh artillery was far, far superior, and the Sikh guns were far superior to any that the British had. if that is the case, which perhaps it isn't, but just taking it for face value, are the kind of the because Lal Singh and Tej Singh are in command and they are taking it in the way that they deem fit, does that kind of ensure that although Sikhs have superior guns, they don't really get to use them in the most effective way? On paper, there are so many different things that kind of make it seem as though the British were just not going to be able to win it. But then when it comes to it, although it is extremely close, they pull it off. So although the Sikh guns are used quite effectively and a lot of the British are shot down, it's almost as though they just weren't effective enough. And I'm just trying to figure out like what ensures that? Is that Lal Singh and Tej Singh, or is that something else?
You're right. Well, you're right to a certain point in the sense that the British, the Sikh guns at Ferozeshah, especially, were very superior to what the British had. What actually happened was that we talked earlier about the British commander-in-chief being sort of overconfident, if you like. The British force that actually fought at Mudki and then at Ferozeshah simply didn't have sufficient heavy guns. They just hadn't brought the big heavy siege guns with them, and so their force was mainly made up of horse artillery and a certain number of heavier guns, whereas the Sikh army at Ferozeshah had a lot of heavier guns. So it was a very one-sided contest, at Ferozeshah. Having said that, what Lal Singh had done was actually dispersed a lot of the Sikh guns, all across, the Sikh camp. So I don't know how sort of familiar you are with, the Battle of Ferozeshah, for instance. The Sikh camp was made into an almost like a square, if you like. And the Sikh guns were sort of dispersed all around the sort of encampment, if you like, around the perimeter. And that's not really the best way of, fighting a battle. What it meant was that the British could choose which side that they wanted to attack on, which side is the weakest, if you like. It was very much a defensive position. Normally, I mean, the best thing would have been to line up your force, directly facing, the British, if you like, and then you can bring to bear all your heavy guns and all your guns to fire. So the Sikh position wasn't really, the sort of ideal position. But having said that, they were used very effectively, and in fact, by all accounts, they actually managed to knock out all the British guns, during the initial cannonade, before the two sides came into hand-to-hand combat, and so it was a very sort of winnable situation, and certainly the next day, the Sikh. Second day of Ferozeshah battle, the Sikh soldiers knew that, the British haven't got anything left now, but, that was a different, that was a different day, and Lal Singh decided to just pull back the Sikh army. But yeah, it was, that battle actually was the first and last time where you had, an appreciable number of Sikh guns, of the Sikh army, being used, if you like. At Mudki, there was a much smaller force with a much smaller number of guns that was sent to take on the British. And at Sobraon, again, they were outgunned by the British as well. And if you look at the Second Anglo-Sikh War, a lot of the Sikh guns had been confiscated by the British after the war. So, that was a totally different situation. But at Ferozeshah, it was very much a case of, the Sikhs being, or the Sikh army being, having the advantage, very much the advantage.
Yeah. No, thank you. When I was reading through, I think it's Pearman's memoirs of the Anglo-Sikh Wars. In it, there's maps that lay out how the armies set up in some of the battles. Now, two that caught my attention were Aliwal and Sobraon, which showed that the Sikh army had their backs to the river. Now, I don't know too much about military strategy, but to me it doesn't make sense having your back against something that someone could push you into. Um, Especially when the entire idea is you need to make up ground. So why was the Sikh army set up like that? Was there actually some type of strategy behind it that made sense and I just don't understand it? Or is this just another case of being set up to fail almost?
Yeah. I mean, one of the things you never do, in a battle is fight with the river or the sea behind your back, because, you just got no space to maneuver, and if you get pushed back, or, you have some sort of reverse on, one of your flanks or whatever, there's nothing you can do. You can't retreat back and counterattack. You just do not have the space there to do that. So, so no one in their right sense would fight, in those sort of positions. Unfortunately, at Aliwal, you had a chap called Ranjit Singh Majitia, who was, a very young chap, and I'm not sure how he quite made, commander at that point. He didn't have much military experience at all. I think he was in his sort of early 20s. So, how he came into that position, I'm not sure. So, I suppose it's the same as with, Lal Singh and Tej Singh. Neither of those guys had much of a military experience at all as well. Lal Singh certainly wasn't even in the army. So, you just do not fight with the river at your back. What happened at Aliwal was that, as with all these battles, Ranjit Singh did not show any initiative. He simply crossed the river into what was technically British territory, and he simply just sat there. He could have done a number of things. He could have attacked Ludhiana, which was, there was which is British controlled, and there was a small garrison there. He could have attacked the British supply convoys, coming from Delhi to reinforce the main British army that was heading towards Sobraon. And there were a number of other smaller British garrisons, nearby as well, which he could have attacked. But he did none of that. He simply crossed the river, and he just simply sat there next to the river, and made camp, waiting for the British to come to him, and which they did eventually, after they'd managed to, get together a lot of these smaller garrisons. And you had the British general Hari Smith came up with a force from Ferozeshah himself, the British general couldn't have wanted for a better position, really. Once they did push the Sikh army back, which was largely made up of irregulars, at Aliwal, it was a much easier battle for the British. Once a lot of these irregulars were sort of dispersed, that put the few Sikh regulars that were still fighting in a very dangerous position. They were eventually, they eventually had to retreat to the river and cross back under heavy fire. And fortunately for a lot of these soldiers, they did manage to make it back to the right bank. But there was a lot of casualties, and a lot of soldiers, Sikh soldiers died, trying to cross back. It's not something that even an amateur sort of general would do, really. But it shows the kind of poverty of leadership that the Sikh army had at that time. And the same goes for Sobraon as well. You know, what Lal Singh and Tej Singh did was they made an encampment on the left bank, with just half the army, you know, situated on the left bank, and the other half of the Sikh army still based on the right bank. You know, in other words, they would not take part in the fighting. So you only had half the Sikh army facing the British army, and obviously what happened was that the British pushed this force back, and again you had the same situation that you had with Aliwal. You know, a lot of Sikh troops trying to cross back, you know, over to the right bank, and you know, just being shot in the river. You know, all you had was a bridge of boats that was used to you know, to bring supplies to the left bank, and that was broken by Lal Singh and Tej Singh as well. So it was a massacre essentially, but both these massacres could have been avoided. You know, had a proper general been in command of the forces.
No. Talking about generals then, and I know we discussed, or we touched upon some of the European generals that were employed in the army at the time. Like, what role do they play? Like, I know quite a lot of them have left, or are starting to leave once Ranjit Singh Ji passes away. Equally, there are a few that stay behind. Like, what are their roles and everything? Considering Lal Singh, Tej Singh seem to be kind of at the helm of everything, where are all the European generals that had kind of built their reputations up until that point?
Well, a lot of them, you know, as you say, had gone back to Europe at this point. You know, from 1839 to end of 1845, you know, that's 6 years. You know, there's a huge amount of turmoil and what have you in the Punjab, and most of them really just upped sticks and, you know, went back, you know, with the, you know, they'd all made their fortunes. You know, there wasn't any point in staying in the Punjab at this point. You know, they could see it disintegrating. And secondly, a lot of the Sikh troops didn't want to take orders from them now anyway. You know, during Ranjit Singh's period, you know, these Europeans had been sort of almost imposed on you know, on the you know, the Sikh regiments, and they accepted that. But in this sort of confused situation, you know, they there was a certain amount of rebellion against, you know, any sort of Gora, you know, Goras leading them, if you like, you know. So it was a difficult situation for them. A lot of them left. There was a few still left actually during the First Anglo-Sikh War. In fact, there was a chap called Hobon who was helping, you know, arrange the defences at Sobraon. But overall, they had a negligible influence, you know, at that stage. And they, you know, all credit to them, you know, they realised that, you know, it's best to get out now rather than, you know, stick around and where you're not wanted. Yeah.
No, fair. Two questions that got sent in by just like people in the community when I posted about this conversation, and they kind of connect together. So one of them was, what were the type of weapons being used by the Sikh army? And then the second one was, considering the quality of, say, for argument's sake, the guns produced by the Sikh Empire, what was the level of industrialization like compared to other nations?
Well, I think the weapons were essentially the same. You know, the British used what was called the Brown Bess musket, which was basically adopted by the Sikh army as well. So in terms of muskets, it was, you know, pretty much the same sort of weapon. The Sikh army tended to use, you know, talwars, you know, rather than bayonets. I'm not quite sure why that's the case, but I think people were, you know, I think the soldiers were just used to, you know, using the heavy talwar, you know, in close quarters fighting rather than the bayonet, which was the, you know, the sort of British staple, if you like. And in there's a lot of accounts of Sikh soldiers, in close quarters fighting with British guys with their bayonets, and it's quite an interesting contest. If the British stay in formation, you just can't get close, because they've got that advantage of reach, if you like, with the bayonet. But once their formation's broken and it's close quarters fighting, then with the Dalwar you've got an advantage there as well. And so it's an interesting sort of comparison, really. It reminds me of the Romans and the Greeks. when the Romans attacked the Greek Greece. You had the Greek phalanxes against the Roman legions who were equipped with swords, whereas the Greeks were used the spears. And so in certain situations you've got the Greeks having the advantage, but once it comes to close quarters fighting, then the sword is superior. So yeah, that was a difference there. In terms of artillery, the Sikh army had, or rather the Ranjit Singh had actually, managed to obtain various artillery pieces, from the British and from Europe as well, and it actually improved on their design as well. So the rate of firepower of a Sikh gun and the way they fired the gun, the technique and the procedure they went through was faster than what the British could do. So I think for every three shots that the Sikh army could fire, I think the British guns could fire too. So it was that sort of ratio. So they had sort of a higher rate of firepower, if you like. So yeah, there was a certain sort of appreciable degree of improvement of these weapons in Punjab. And so that was the interesting thing. Regarding industrialization, I don't think Ranjit Singh really had that time to actually implement any sort of large industrialization, and by the sort of 1830s, he was getting on a bit as well. So he'd sort of lost his initial sort of dynamism anyway. I know you wanted to, I was reading an account, a few months ago about him wanting to have steamships, running up and down the rivers in Punjab. So he actually had some of these European officers bringing in technology regarding steamships that he wanted to introduce. So there was things like that, but I think that came too late. And obviously after he died, there just wasn't any interest left at all. There's you had all the infighting. Nobody's interested in that sort of thing at all as well. But I mean, I think if he'd survived another sort of 15, 20 years, then we may have seen, certainly he liked to copy and, if he can, better, the kind of technology that the British had. So things like the telegraph, the railways were being introduced, into India. He would have introduced those, but that never came into, never materialized.
No, definitely. I know you briefly mentioned earlier about the Cis-Sutlej states and kind of how they played somewhat of a neutral role during the wars. one particular question that got sent in was, what was the role of the Phulkian Misl and the Royal House of Patiala in particular?
Well, I think you've got to remember that they were sort of semi-independent states, or they were independent till they, accepted British, you know, British authority, if you like. So they were never really aligned with, Ranjit Singh. In fact, they sort of feared him, because they knew that he wanted to, unify the whole Sikh GOM, But looking at it from their point of view, they would have lost their independence. So, from their point of view, it was worth, allying themselves with the British. And that's what they did, and I suppose that's just the natural way of things, really. Ranjit Singh managed to unify the Misls, north of the Sutlej. But if you'd asked these Misls when he was trying to consolidate, power over Punjab himself, they would have, they were fighting against him as well.
Well, I guess it'd be fair to say that he conquered them rather than unified them, because I think it then, I think the first terms makes it seem like they agreed to be part of the new empire he formed, but obviously he was, I think, just as much as the British were conquering India, he was conquering Punjab, to be fair, and obviously engulfed all of these Misls within obviously his territory. So no, that's absolutely fair. Would it then be fair to say that most of these Cis-Sutlej states, they when I say they never had formal relations with the Sikh Empire, as in they had always been independent, so there was never say a treaty, or there was never kind of allyship between these different sub-states and the Sikh Empire from the get-go, or was it almost when the British arrived things changed?
Well, I think that the impression I get with Ranjit Singh is that he almost sort of gave up trying to sort of gain control of these states. After he made the treaty with the British, Treaty of Amritsar, which limited him to the Punjab, to the north of the Sutlej River. So there were good relations, but these states had effectively given their independence away, to be underneath the British, and that gave them safety. And I suppose they. It's difficult to say what they really, the rulers of these states really, where their allegiance really lay, if you like. I mean, certainly when war broke out, if they had not helped the British could not have, managed to sort of approach the Sutlej River, simply because their supply lines would have been too long. They were dependent on, Patiala and Dabar for their convoys from Delhi to come towards, Ferozeshah and Sobraon. So it would have been pretty much impossible for them to actually fight these battles where they were fought. And similarly with the Second Anglo-Sikh War, most of the battles in the Second Anglo-Sikh War were actually fought, much further west. And again, the British had to bring a lot of their supplies from Delhi and Meerut, those sort of places. Very long supply lines, and again, these passed through Patiala and through Lahore and right up to the Jhelum. So these states, people tend to sort of dismiss them, but they were actually quite important in their own way in sort of aiding a British victory. It's something that people don't really realize, when they read up about the Anglo-Sikh Wars. The fact that a lot of places stayed neutral. And again, you had the Dogra brothers, Glab Singh in, ruling Kashmir. You stayed neutral. You had various other states as well, Muslim states staying neutral as well. So it's a very complex situation. It's not just simply, a sort of Anglo-Sikh conflict, if you like.
Would it be fair then to say that a lot of these individuals who stayed neutral, so for argument's sake, Gulab Singh, is it because they've kind of tallied up the fact that if they were to oppose the British, they're just going to get decimated, and therefore it's kind of a survival instinct of, actually, if I befriend the kind of the enemy of my enemy, I'm fine? Or is there more to it? So for argument's sake, like, if in a hypothetical situation, I don't know, the Jind, or the states that they're taking their supply lines through turned around and told the British, actually, no, we're not going to let you do that. That obviously would have made things a lot harder. And had, hypothetically, Gulab Singh Dogra said, actually, I'll oppose the British alongside you guys, like, would it have made, and I guess this is one of those what if questions, and technically the answer could be anything, but like, if the events had been different and that, like, for argument's sake, those states hadn't allied with the British, or certain individuals hadn't remained neutral, would that have actually impacted things, in your opinion, or would it have not made much of a kind of difference?
I think it would have made a big difference, actually. We've just talked about the Cis-Sutlej states. If they'd actually worked with the Sikh Empire, certainly things would have been very difficult for the British, to sort of advance towards the Punjab. It was a very close-run thing for Ferozeshah. Anything could have tipped it either way. The Lal Singh had pulled the Sikh forces back, but if Gulab Singh had his army there, if Tej Singh had come across, or if any of the other sort of neutral parties, if you like, there was talk about the Gurkhas, the Nepalese invading during the First and Second Anglo-Sikh Wars as well, take advantage of the conflict that's going on for their own benefit. If they had invaded as well. So again, that would have changed the equation quite a bit as well. So, it's important to remember these were very close-run things. There was two battles that were very close, Ferozeshah and Chillianwala. The other ones were pretty much easy British victories for one reason or another. But in these two sort of, very climactic battles, anything could have pushed it either way. So it's it would have been interesting if these guys and these neutral parties, if you like, had involved themselves in one way or another.
Okay, no, thank you. Just then moving into kind of the first Anglo-Sikh War as just the central focus of discussion. So a lot of the British accounts portray the Sikhs as the aggressors, concentrating their forces at locations such as near the Sutlej. And it's kind of interesting for me because my family Bind is literally just north of the Sutlej. It's about, I don't know, like a 10-minute drive from Phillaur. Just coming back to the question. So they kind of blame the Sikhs and they say they were the aggressors. They say that these guys are the ones kind of concentrating their forces. They do admit that the British forces are also doubling at places like Ludhiana and Ambala under Henry Harding, even though they've apparently been given instructions not to engage in conflict with the Sikhs. So I guess this is again one of those eternal questions which historians will continue probably to debate, which is what are the main reasons for that first Anglo-Sikh War breaking out? Like what triggers it? Like, and again, I understand that actually it's probably not just one event. There's probably numerous kind of dominoes that lead to the straw that breaks the camel's back, so to speak. But in your estimation, what are perhaps like the most important reasons for that initial spark to the conflict?
Yeah, it was quite a strange sort of start to the war, Amar. There was a feeling amongst the Sikh soldiers that they wanted to give it a go against the British, and this had been a feeling there, for decades, once Ranjit Singh had established himself, the obvious enemy was the British. So although there was friendly relations between, the Sikhs and the British, there was always this sort of, how would we fare against them sort of thing, and we can beat them, so there was this huge confidence there. But during Ranjit Singh's time, obviously, there was peace, so this situation never came into being. After his death, people like Lal Singh, Tej Singh knew that they had to get, the Sikh army away out of politics, and the obvious solution was just to sort of pitch them against the British. So that was their motivation for the war. Now, having said that, what they did do was they ordered the Sikh army across the Sutlej River. Now, the treaty that the Sikh, that Ranjit Singh had made with the British was that although he had lands south of the Sutlej River, the Sikh army would never cross into these territories. So these were Ranjit Singh's territories, but no military force was allowed there. Now, what Lal Singh did was he ordered the Sikh army across the Sutlej River. So technically, it was a Sikh army that broke this agreement. But having said that, they were still on, Sikh territory. They were still on Lahore territory. They had not crossed into British territory at all. So you have this sort of grey area about whether they'd actually and there wasn't any declaration of war either. This was a strange thing. Lal Singh, he didn't want to. He was obviously allied with the British. He doesn't want to declare war, because that compromises his own position. He wanted to keep his position after the war, and the same with Tej Singh. So there was no declaration of war. The Sikh army crossed, and it just basically sat there, at Ferozepur and at Ferozeshah. So, is that really an invasion of British territory? No, it wasn't technically. But then again, they did break this, treaty that a Sikh military force will never cross the river as well. So, you have this sort of grey area, and certainly none of the British garrisons, along this, the border with the Sikh Empire were attacked as well. The British had a large force at, Ferozepur, which could have been attacked. In fact, Tej Singh just kept his army, a couple of miles away from, the British cantonments. Why? If you're going for war, then you attack you would attack this force. And similarly, at Ludhiana, there was a couple of other, fortified places that the British had, small garrisons, strung out. Jagram, I think they had, and there was a couple of other places as well, which could have been mopped up by the Sikh army, before the main British force came up. They didn't do that as well. So, there was no hostility, at that point. But what triggered things off was the British Governor General, declaring war and saying, look, you shouldn't have crossed this river. That's it, we're coming. And they were ready for war anyway. They could see, the country disintegrating, and they could guess that, somebody like Lal Singh, as the, Lahore Prime Minister, would send the Sikh army across just to get them all out of his hair, if you like. So they were ready for war anyway. So, the whole thing is you could write a book on, all this sort of, odds and ends and, microaggressions and other things. The British actually bought a bridge of boats up as well. So they were ready for an invasion of Punjab as well. They also arranged a number of supply depots from Delhi as well. So they were actually ready for war as well. So, you can make of that what you will.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. That was really good. Just then kind of moving into the battles of the first Anglo-Sikh War. So when I was doing a little bit of background research, the 5 main battles that popped up were Mudki, Ferozeshah, Baddowal, Aliwal and Sobraon. However, I also came across a few other what were referred to almost as like minor skirmishes. 2 of them apparently took place before Mudki, which were Wadni Fort and Phillaur Fort. The Phillaur bit is interesting because that's also that fort is near my family Bind. And there was also reportedly a battle after Sobraon, which is the Battle of Kangrah. What are these 3 skirmishes or battles, and how do they fit into the kind of the wider context of things? Because if I'm honest, I've never actually come across them before until I had to do a little bit of research for this. So, are they important? What is going on at these events? How do they fit into the wider context?
Yeah. Well, no, they're not really battles at all. Wadni was a place, it's a village, obviously, along the way, which fell in the path of the advancing British. And there actually used to be a small fort there, which was occupied by Sikh soldiers. So this was actual, Lahore territory, Wadni was in. When the British force came up, the force inside evacuated. They simply weren't, numerically sufficient. They didn't have any guns either. So it was literally just an outpost. They evacuated that fort, and the British took it over and then, kept advancing towards Mudki. So there wasn't really a battle there. So I'm not quite sure about that one. Phillaur, obviously you've got, Lahore, Ranjit Singh's, large fortress there. And that was actually occupied by the British after the First Anglo-Sikh War. It used to be one of Ranjit Singh's treasuries as well. And in fact, it was a fort that the British used, to guard the Sutlej River, along with a garrison across the river at Ludhiana as well. So it was very important for them as well. But there wasn't any sort of conflict there, or rather there was during the mutiny actually, but that's a different subject. But Kangrah, now Kangrah is a fortress in the, in Kangrah, obviously in, the foothills of the Himalayas. And this was a fortress that after the First Anglo-Sikh War, the treaty was made that the entire, Jalandhar, area would pass to the British. So, that was annexed by them. And that obviously included Kangrah as well, being in the east there. Now the commander of the Kangrah fortress, he was a bit of a nationalist, and he didn't want to hand it over. And it was actually quite a powerful fortress. I don't know if you've been to this fortress, but it's built in a really strategic location. It's very difficult to conquer. Not very difficult to grab hold of this fortress. And he decided, look, I don't want to hand it over, and he was told by the Lahore Darbar, look, we've made this treaty with the British, you've got to hand it over, but he didn't want to. So the British had to actually haul a lot of heavy guns, towards Kangrah to try and, gain the fortress. And so they actually managed to drag a lot of these guns up there. Now, whether they could have got it or not, I'm not sure, because it is a very difficult place to attack, even with, big siege guns, the way it's built, and there's only one access to it, if you like, and a very steep, sort of upward sort of path to the fortress itself. So even with guns, it would have been very difficult to actually, to win there. The commander, when he saw, the British force arrive, he decided to give up. He didn't have enough of a garrison anyway. So once the British made a big show of force in front of him, he sort of started negotiations effectively. We want pensions, we want this, we want that. If you give us those, all right, we'll give it to you. So he sort of gave up. I think he was hoping that a lot of the other smaller garrisons, along all the foothills and other places would join him. So he wanted to be the sort of inspiration for a rebellion, but it never quite took off. And certainly he didn't have the force to do anything about it, on his own as well. So anyway, he gave up. So so there wasn't a battle there as well, but it was a key issue after the First War, certainly.
No, thank you for clearing that up, because I was a bit curious as to what these events were and how they fitted into obviously the wider context. So no, thank you for that. Just moving into then the interwar period, which is probably the bit that I find most interesting. So what is actually happening post Sobraon? Obviously, kind of the British in their perspective, and to be fair, they've won, kind of quote unquote. What then happens kind of between that and then the outbreak of the Second Anglo-Sikh War? And in and amongst this, what role, if any, does Rani Jind play in what happens? There's obviously loads of debate about whether she had kind of any part to play in the demise of the army or not, and kind of she's sometimes seen as others as this kind of strong independent leader who kind of took a stance against the British, although then people claim that there's correspondence between her and the British, and then it gets a lot murkier, and kind of the further you go down the rabbit hole, the more confusing it gets. So what is going on in this period, and what role does she play within this kind of context?
Yeah, I mean, as you say, it's a very interesting period. Maharani Jind, she was pretty much like Lal Singh and Tej Singh, actually. Before the First War, she was sort of sick and tired of the Sikh army being sort of intruding into political affairs, and as you may know, her brother was actually assassinated by the army as well. So she had very little sympathy there. So she was actually, hoping, like Lal Singh and Tej Singh, that the British would sort of take over the Punjab, bring it to a sort of stable situation. Obviously, leave her in charge, leave Lal Singh as a prime minister and Tej Singh as the commander-in-chief, which is what happened. In fact, all these three characters retained their positions, which they had before the war. And she hoped things would, just carry on, as before, obviously, but, accepting British, authority, if you like. It's a bit like what happened in Baddowal, for instance. When the British took over after the Battle of Plassey, the various Nawabs thought that they could handle the British. They've managed to the British beat the previous Nawab, but in Plassey, the ones that came after him thought, oh look, we've been raised to this position, but we'll handle it and retain our independence, and hopefully get it back as well. So I think that's what she was thinking as well. She was thinking that I've managed to use the British, but hopefully things will carry on as they were. But that wasn't the case. The British started to sort of take over more and more as well. And in fact, she was sidelined almost completely, after a few months. Lal Singh was, got rid of by the British. The British had started to dismantle the Sikh army as well. So a lot of the veteran troops were dismissed, given their pensions. That's it, you're out. So the whole sort of weakening of the state was sort of being carried out. So that period between start of 1846, when the first Anglo-Sikh War finished, to sort of mid 1848, so you've got about 2.5 years, was a period where the British resident was gaining more and more control, if you like, of the state. And by the end of that, there was a chap called Frederick Curry, who'd there's a chap called Henry Lawrence, and then John Lawrence, and you had somebody called Frederick Curry who'd taken over, who were effectively the Maharajas of Lahore now. They didn't really ask the Lahore Darbar anything. They had the power to sort of run the state, so that was the situation. And Rani Jind probably realized this pretty early on. This situation's getting out of control. I've been sidelined, as with other states which are sort of semi-independent, and gradually losing their independence to the British, as the British sort of gain control. She found out as well too late, and people like to see her as some sort of heroine, but I think she was she was an ordinary person thrust into a role which she wasn't really trained for. She was one of the she was pretty young, had no experience of statesmanship. If you'd asked Ranjit Singh, would Maharani Jind be in control of the state at some point, after his death, he would have been surprised, because she was one of his lesser queens, if you like, the younger ones. He had, other sons that were older than, Dalip Singh. So the chances of her actually coming to the front and Dalip Singh, being the Maharaja of Lahore, were actually quite poor, during his lifetime. But with all the assassinations and, that happened after that, these two, mother and son came to the fore, if you like. But she wasn't really, like I said, she wasn't really trained for the role. I think she was a little bit out of her depth, to be honest, and things had gone beyond her control anyway. With the Sikh army beaten, and the British having sort of taken control of Punjab, there was very little she could have done anyway. But she did raise a lot of issues with the British resident, regarding how she was being treated. But war, you'd think that this would have been the cause of the war, but in fact, war actually broke out in the deep south of the country, a place called Multan, where you had a chap called, Diwan Mulraj, who was the governor of the city, resigning, and a British officer had gone to actually take control of the city, and he was killed by the garrison there, who didn't want him to take over, and that was a trigger for the war, effectively. So it came as almost a big surprise. Nobody anticipated war would break out. And it was certainly a city where there were hardly any Sikh troops as well. Diwan Mulraj was a Hindu. It's a largely Muslim city. The garrison was largely Muslim. There was a lot of Hindus. It's about 50-50 at that time, Multan. So you had, a place where, there's hardly any Sikh army there at all anyway. But conflict broke out. The British decided to, teach Divan Mul Raj a lesson. He was now the reluctant head of this new rebellion. He, just like with the First War, you've got a leadership which doesn't really want to fight the British. So it's a very sort of strange scenario. But anyway, he became the reluctant leader of this rebellion at Multan, and some Sikh troops were sent to Multan to help the British force there, to actually recapture the city. They rebelled. They thought, why not? This is this is the ideal time to rebel as well. So they were led by a chap called Sher Singh. So they sort of browbeat him into, declaring war as well against the British. And of course, Sher Singh's father, Chandra Singh, was governor of Hazara as well, province. And he rebelled against the British as well, very reluctantly as well. He was actually quite an ill person, a sick person, exactly what you don't want leading a rebellion, a very, very sickly person. But he was, this is probably another story, but he was given quite a hard time by the British officer in charge of Hazara there. So he rebelled as well. So suddenly this very odd rebellion at Multan suddenly becomes an Anglo-Sikh war. So again, a very sort of murky way of a war starting, just like the first one.
That's amazing. And so, just to clarify, technically the Second Anglo-Sikh War is an accident, because from what you said, Diwan Mul Raj resigns, and it's because his soldiers kill the British guy who turns up that everything sparked off. So technically, I know it's not an accident in like the truest sense, but there wasn't ever really an intention for the Second Anglo-Sikh War. Like, it just almost occurs with a flick of, with Matey being murdered, but almost with the flick of a switch.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, nobody had actually planned to fight a war. And in fact, technically, it can't really be considered an Anglo-Sikh war anyway, simply because Multan was part of Punjab. And so it was technically, Sikh territory. So there was no invasion of, British territory. Diwan Mul Raj, again, had not declared war against the British. So he was technically rebelling against, the Lahore state, not against the British. So, there was this sort of toing and froing in British high circles as to, is this really an Anglo-Sikh war? Or is this just a rebellion within, the Lahore state? But of course, they decided to take advantage of that, and it became a declaration of war against the Punjab. But strangely enough, the Lahore Darbar, the Sikh government, was actually on the side of the British, during this war, believe it or not. So they actually supplied, the British with, I can't remember how many thousands of camels and, hackeries and carts to transport munitions and what have you, because they saw Mul Raj and Sher Singh as rebels, if you like. And they were perfectly happy to work underneath the British. So, in this war, as with the first one, I guess, the Lahore government was actually acting against its own army.
Insane.
Yeah.
I absolutely love these conversations because I get to learn, and obviously everyone listening as well gets to learn so much in such a short space of time. So no, that I really, really appreciate that answer, because it's cleared up a lot of questions that I had and provides a lot of context without having to kind of trawl through loads of books. So no, thank you a lot for that. Just sticking then with the second Anglo-Sikh War, although strictly that isn't really the best term to use. So there are four main engagements from what I could gather. So there's Ramnuggar, Sadulpore, which are apparently close and inconclusive contests. And then there's Chillianwala and Gujrat, which are said to be far more fiercely contested and kind of the decisive battles in this second leg. So could you just explain a little bit about these different engagements and what occurs, and kind of like how do they like kind of reach their conclusion? Like what is the change that's kind of achieved after this set of battles?
Okay, well, once you had the outbreak of war at Multan, Sher Singh managed to sort of collect what he could, of the Sikh army. Obviously, it'd been, greatly reduced by the British. But what he had, he managed to accumulate them. And he also, made a call to all the veterans that sort of retired. So you had a lot of older but more experienced soldiers joining his force as well, and anybody else he could, gather as well. Now, he was very much up against it, in terms of financing the war. He was not getting any money from, the Lahore treasury, because that's controlled by the British. Lahore was under British possession, British control. So he had to sort of finance the war by himself. So he was pretty much up against it, in terms of of financing it. In terms of artillery, as we mentioned earlier, a lot of the Sikh guns had been confiscated by the British after the First War, and certainly all the heavy ones. There might have been a few left, but most of the heavy guns had been confiscated. So he was up against it in terms of having the firepower as well. And in terms of logistics as well, he was up against it simply because the Lahore government is actually actively working with the British as well. So it's a very difficult situation, but what he decided to do was set up camp along the river. And sorry, which one was it? It's along the Jhelum River, yeah. So it's sorry, what was the other river? I've forgotten the one that's just east of Jhelum. It's totally slipped my mind. But he formed the Sikh army next to the river, and with the idea of contesting, with the idea of stopping the British from, managing to cross the river, if you like. So it was a good position, but the British managed to sort of bypass his position and cross the river anyway. But before they managed to cross the river, there was a short skirmish at Ramnuggar, which was inconclusive. The British lost a couple of guns, as they advanced towards the river, but it was a cavalry conflict, and they actually got lured into the river, and they had a reasonable number of casualties, which a lot of people criticised Gough for. Gough, who was the British commander-in-chief. So it was an advantage to the Sikhs, but it wasn't a conclusive battle in any way. And the same with Sadulpore as well. That was a rearguard action. Once the British had crossed the river, Sher Singh sent a force to Sadulpore to sort of protect his rear, if you like, while he retreated to Chillianwala. So again, a very small conflict, not particularly important in any way. But what that meant was that the two armies were now facing each other at Chillianwala, and that's the way they sat for a number of weeks, actually, until the British commander decided to attack. He was actually held back by the British Governor General, who was a little bit apprehensive, because Chillianwala is quite a distance away from Delhi, so the British supply lines were actually quite long, and he didn't want Gough to be lured, further and further west, because that would have meant trouble, in terms of supplying his force. So he was held back for a bit, but eventually, the two armies clashed, and it was a bit of a surprise. Gough decided to attack when I think it was about 4 p.m. at night, and this was in January, when obviously nights are very, days are very short. And so as soon as they were attacking, you had night falling. So it was a very confused battle. But what happened was that pretty much half the British force was repelled quite badly. And with the other half, just managing to hold their line, if you like, or having some success. But with the fall of night, the whole sort of battle is taking place in a jungle. As you can imagine, there was a huge amount of confusion. Nobody knows what's going on. And if Sher Singh had decided to, advance at this point, which he didn't, he was actually a very cautious sort of person. As with all Anglo-Sikh battles, the Sikh army always fights on the defensive. Similarly at Chillianwala, they stayed in their line. They did not take advantage of the chance that they had. The confused sort of situation that the British found themselves in could have been, it could have turned into a disaster effectively if the Sikh army had advanced, but they didn't. And the British sort of recovered the following day and found that they'd actually lost quite a high number of casualties. So, but they managed to capture a few Sikh guns. So they declared it a victory, it's a sort of a draw. I would consider it a draw, actually. Although, as with Ferozeshah, if the Sikh army had attacked, then it would have been very different. But in terms of the actual result, it was a draw. Now, Sher Singh made the mistake after Chillianwala of deciding to march towards Lahore. And I think he wanted to actually capture, Lahore itself, which was a mistake. He had a very good position at Chillianwala, and he should have actually stayed there. But what it meant was that he had to advance back eastwards, and territory which was absolutely plain, and that gave the British a huge advantage, because they had a huge advantage in cavalry and artillery as well. And Battle of Gujrat was actually pretty much a sort of walkover for the British. With very few casualties, they managed to sort of almost bomb the Sikh line into oblivion. In fact, it's called the Battle of the Guns, for very good reason, because it was almost entirely an artillery affair. And Gough he'd learned his lessons at Chillianwala, about a full frontal attack, and he let his guns do the work in this battle. And they literally just bombed the Sikh line, out of existence. Sher Singh never had the artillery, as we've talked about earlier, to actually compete with the British guns. So that was a big mistake. He should never have, offered battle at this position, and it was a disaster. And after Gujrat, the Sikh army attempted to retreat back, back across the Indus River, going further and further west. But unfortunately, they couldn't do so for a number of reasons. And so, a few weeks after Gujrat, they, you had the surrender of the Sikh army taking place. And that was it, really. That was the end of the conflict. followed by, the annexation of the Punjab.
Just then, kind of wrapping up, there's two questions that I'd love to get your input on. So the first one is almost just wrapping up all the loose ends. So we've obviously discussed that the fate of Punjab is it gets annexed, and we all kind of know what happens from that point onwards. It becomes part of the empire and everything else that goes with that. What is the fate? And we've also discussed about how the army is basically, they surrender and everyone's kind of disbanded along with the annexation. What happens to some of the other kind of key players that we've spoken about? So Lal Singh, Tej Singh, the Dogra brothers. I think the one Muraj is executed by the British, if I'm not mistaken. But like, just in terms of these kind of key characters that we've discussed kind of over the last couple of hours, what happens to them when annexation takes place, or where are they? Perhaps is the best question.
Yeah, it's quite strange. None of them really lasted very long, Amar. Diwan Mulraj, he was actually imprisoned in Calcutta for a while, and he suffered his health deteriorated pretty badly, during this incarceration. And he passed away, a few years after the war. So he didn't really last very long. And it was the same with, Gulab Singh, ruler of Kashmir. He actually died as in 1857, as the mutiny was taking place, in India. So he just lasted another 8 years as well. Lal Singh, he, as we talked about earlier, he was actually overthrown from his position by the British, as prime minister. He retired to Agra, and he just spent his time really just in retirement, doing nothing. I think he went to Dehradun after that as well. But he was a rich man. He had a comfortable living. Never took part in politics again, and wasn't allowed to anyway, to sort of dabble in these things. And I'm not sure when he died, actually. I'm not sure anyone knows when he died, but he just sort of sank into obscurity, just like where he came from. So all these characters, Tej Singh, he was actually very pro-British, as in the Anglo-Sikh Wars. He actually actively helped the British during the Second Anglo-Sikh War, and he actually volunteered to help recruit troops during, the mutiny, 1857 as well. So 8 years after that, he was made the Raja of can't remember his place now. But he was honoured quite heavily by the British, for his assistance. And I remember reading he wanted his jagirs and things to pass on to his son, but I'm not sure the British were too keen on that. And of course you had Rani Jind, who's again, she passed away very at quite an early age as well. So it's quite a strange thing, but a lot of these characters didn't really survive into the 1870s or 1880s. It's quite a strange event. But we do have some images of some of these guys. I mean, obviously Maharani Jind, there's that famous portrait of her. There is a picture of Lal Singh that's been doing the rounds. I can't remember the name of the collector now. It's Tour, isn't it? He owns that picture of Lal Singh. But there's one of Mulraj as well. Yeah. Unfortunately, there was a picture of Sher Singh, who led the Sikh army during the Second Anglo-Sikh War, but it's missing. There used to be one in the National Army Museum, but the album that it should have been in, it's disappeared. Yeah, these pictures were taken when they were in captivity in Lahore. After the Second Anglo-Sikh War, Mulraj was brought into Lahore, same as Sher Singh and Chandra Singh, his father, and they were kept in, the Lahore fortress. And the photographer wanted to take a lot of pictures of these guys, but the resident, the British resident in Lahore, didn't want the prisoners bothered, in quotes. So he sort of stopped the photographer from taking more pictures. I've forgotten the name of the photographer now.
I think it was John McCosh, but
yeah, that's it, McCosh.
Yeah.
McCosh wasn't allowed to take any more pictures. So this picture of Mulraj and the missing one of Sher Singh were probably taken without the authority of without the go-ahead from the resident. So so nice little story there.
Yeah. My last question, and this is almost a question that opens up an entire another podcast episode, which I'm sure we'll do in the near future, which is considering the and this is something that comes up time and again, which is considering how close the Anglo-Sikh Wars are to the mutiny. And again, this is just coming from the gross popular narrative, which is, it's almost like, because they're so close together, there's almost a shock at the fact that the Sikhs, quote unquote, the Sikhs, don't kind of en masse take part in the mutiny. And in fact, they're almost used, or they're almost part, not almost, they are part of the British machinery, which helps to suppress the mutiny. How is it achieved? How does Punjab go from being annexed in 48, 49 to then, or not even a decade later, just refusing to engage, not refusing, but just kind of simplifying it, almost refusing to engage in toppling the same entity that had annexed it? What is going on in the background to achieve that?
Well, I think you've got to remember that, the Sikh soldiers were soldiers, by trade, and they needed, one of the great stories I find, after the end of the Second Anglo-Sikh War is, after the surrender, after the Sikh army surrenders, is that a lot of the Sikh soldiers actually approached the the British officers, asking for jobs in the East India Company's forces. So they did not want to go back to the pens and back to doing kheti. That's not what they're there for. They're professional soldiers, so they need an army that they can serve with. So so there was always this sort of aspiration to rejoin an army, if you like. I think the most important thing to remember is that there was a lot of dislike of the sepoys that the British used, in the Punjab. They were very sort of overbearing. They made a nuisance of themselves. They taunted the population. They taunted the Sikh soldiers, where they went. During that, from 1849 to 57, that's 8 years. They were very heavily disliked. Not by just the veteran Sikh soldiers, but by the population as a whole, and not just the population of Punjab as a whole, but all the border areas as well. So all the Pathans and all the Trans-Indus region, those tribal people, Muslim tribes and what have you. They had an absolute dislike of these, what they call Purbias. They called them Easterners. So they were very unpopular. So when the mutiny broke out, there was hardly any chance of these veteran Sikh soldiers wanting to ally themselves with these Purbias, or Easterners. So there was that. The other thing was that there was simply no leadership that could have inspired the Punjabis to sort of to rise up, if you like. At that stage, Rani Jind had gone. Maharaja Dalip Singh was not even in the Punjab. It was in England. There simply was no one there to sort of take advantage of the situation. The British were very apprehensive about the Punjab. It took them around about 3 months to organize an invasion of, and successfully attack and recapture Delhi. During those 3 months, it could have gone either way in the Punjab, because they knew that people hadn't forgotten the Anglo-Sikh Wars. They hadn't forgotten that they were independent. So if the situation had arose, if the right leader had arose, it could very easily have gone against the British. But a good salary with the British, that was a lure that the sepoys couldn't offer. They could not offer any money. They weren't liked, and importantly, it wouldn't have resulted in, an independence for Punjab again anyway, because they were fighting, on behalf of, the Mughal emperor, Badshah. So really, even if they'd managed to help the sepoys, even if the uprising had been successful, the mutiny had been successful, it wouldn't have, there wouldn't have been anything in it for Punjabis in general. It would have meant, the re-establishment of some sort of Mughal empire. So there's quite a lot of other reasons for it as well. But I mentioned earlier, I'm writing a book on, the mutiny in the Punjab in 1857. So I'll elaborate on those quite heavily. It's a really interesting story, what happened in the Punjab.
I can well imagine, and again, that's also why I thought it'd be a good place to ask this question right at the end, because it obviously then opens up the opportunity to do another episode kind of just related to what's going on in relation to the mutiny. But I just thought, considering how close the two events are, it'd be worth asking you about it now as well. I just wanted to check, I've gone through all of the questions that I wanted to go over. I just wanted to check, is there anything that you wanted to kind of add in, or anything that we've missed just before we kind of wrap up? Because just like to double check.
No, not really. I think we've covered everything pretty well, Amar. So
Yeah.
Appreciate your questions, and these things you can just keep talking about them for hours and days. Each question that you've posed, we can literally do a podcast on. Each battle, you could talk about it for hours. But no, it's great. It's good to have this conversation with you, and hopefully we've made it a little bit easier for anyone who's not too up on these things to sort of understand what went on in the Punjab during that period.
So you finally made it to the end of another episode. I hope you really enjoyed it. If you've got any other questions about the Anglo-Sikh Wars that we haven't covered, please put them in the questions below, and I would be more than happy to do another podcast with Amarpal. At the same time, I'm already planning to do a podcast with him regarding the siege of Delhi. So again, if you've got any other questions, please put them in the comments below. Unfortunately, there's no bloopers today, so otherwise than that, I will see you in the next one.